Have you ever stumbled upon a dark family secret? Story 1. My grandmother knows all the hidden family secrets, but she's always been too proper to talk about them. Until one night, when she finally told me something about my grandfather's, her husband's family. Apparently, they were extremely poor, living on the streets and trying to earn money during Australia's gold rush. The family had too many children and not enough income, so they ended up selling one of their kids to a Chinese businessman. That child would have been my grandfather's great uncle, I suppose. No one ever knew about it, and she hasn't spoken a word about it since that night. Story 2. I found out over Christmas, while doing a family history search online, that my dad had fathered two children with a different woman about 20 years ago. Side note, he and my mother have been married for over 35 years. When I searched his name, results came up not only for myself and my two brothers' births, but for two others as well. Since he has a very uncommon first and last name, curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging further. The births were registered in the north of England in the Newcastle area. That immediately set off alarm bells because my dad had worked in that region for 5 years with his company in the early 1990s. I was just a little kid at the time and missed him terribly, as did my brothers and mum. He was working on a 2-week on, 2-week off rotation, so he was always coming and going. I decided to dig a little deeper to confirm my suspicions. I found the children's, now adult women's, Facebook pages. They still use the last name they were given at birth, which was our father's. I didn't reach out to them directly because I suspected they didn't know they had siblings. Instead, I contacted their mother. At first, I told her I was a relative of my dad's and that I was trying to learn more about any children he might have had. I explained I was trying to find him. After I sent her a few details and a photo from that time period, she confirmed he was the father of her children. She proved it without question by scanning and sending me copies of the birth certificates and some photos of him with her and their daughters when they were babies. She asked me to call her, I did. I can't say I was anxious about the call, but I remember feeling furious. Furious at him for what he'd done to my mother and to us as a family. While he had supposedly been working hard and all alone up north, his wife and children sat patiently waiting in Wales every 2 weeks for 5 years. I told her my real name and that I was, in fact, his daughter. I had believed I was his only daughter until that moment. I also told her about my two older brothers and the fact that my parents had been married for over 35 years. The poor woman cried out over the phone. She had no idea. When she met my father in a pub in Newcastle, it was about 3 months after he had moved there. He told her he was single, had no family, and was from Wales, though he lied about which part. A few months later, she became pregnant with their first child, and about a year later, they had a second daughter. She said that when he traveled to Wales every 2 weeks, he claimed it was for work and that he would call her from a phone box because he didn't have a landline. When the girls were very young, the eldest about 3, he left one day to work in Wales and never returned. She tried contacting the company he worked for, only to learn he no longer worked there. Around that same time, his 5 years in Newcastle ended, and he moved back to Wales. Because he had lied about where he lived, she couldn't trace him. Now left alone with 2 children and no job, she had to move on. After about a month, she realized he was gone for good. She had no clue he had a full family back in Wales, a wife, kids, mortgage, and even a dog. If she had known, she never would have entered a relationship with him, let alone had children. I haven't confronted him, obviously because of my mother, but Christmas was incredibly difficult for me after learning the truth. In the 2 days leading up to it, I drank excessively and ended up sleeping through Christmas Day for 18 hours straight. I missed the whole celebration. My father was angry, saying I had ruined Christmas, and I nearly lost control, but I kept quiet. Then on Boxing Day, the mother from Newcastle called again. She told me she had carefully informed her daughters about what happened and said she'd let them decide how to handle it. So far, they haven't done anything. We haven't contacted each other since. However, the mother did check in with me around February. She's a very kind woman. She asked if I'd be visiting the North anytime soon and wondered if I'd like to meet them. I told her I'd think about it. Coincidentally, I'm going to Newcastle in 2 months for a hen party, so it's on my mind more now. Part of me hopes they come knocking on our door. They know where we are now, but another part of me dreads it because of my mother. Over the past 7 months, my relationship with my father has deteriorated. He says it's the reason for his stress, and now he claims it's making his heart condition worse, for which he takes medication. My parents chalk it up to some sort of mid-20s rebellion, because I never rebelled as a teenager, apparently. Truthfully, I feel an overwhelming urge to lash out every time I see him. The next step for me is to tell my oldest brother. He's more serious and mature and might be able to handle it better. He's never had a strong relationship with our dad, so I think he deserves to know. His wife, who's also my best friend, already suspects something is wrong because I've been struggling emotionally. Honestly, I feel like I'm having a breakdown. The weight of this secret is too much. Even my job performance is suffering. Part of me wants those girls to come looking for their father just so the truth is out and the burden is lifted. But once that happens, how do you go back? My mother is a proud but fragile woman, and this revelation would break her. Story 3. My dad recently told me a family story about one of his older, distant relatives. We'll call her Jill, mainly because I don't remember her actual name. This all happened about 70 years ago, around 20 years before my father was born. It's a bit unclear what exactly happened, but I'll do my best to piece it together. Jill was a plain-looking girl, raised on a small country farm. Being a quiet tomboy, she didn't go to school, but spent her time caring for the farm's horses. One day during her teenage years, Jill was in the stables when something spooked one of the horses. It reared up and kicked her in the face. Due to the limited medical options at the time, she was left disfigured and scarred. Afterwards, she withdrew from society and lived a reclusive life on the farm. Years went by in isolation, and one day Jill simply vanished. Maybe her immediate family knew what had happened, but no one in the extended family had any idea. That remained the case until they were notified of her death 4 years later. It turned out Jill had run away and enlisted in the military. She had fought overseas in World War II and had been killed in action. That may not sound like much at first, but remember, only men were allowed to fight in World War II. Somehow Jill had posed as a man for 4 years in the army without being discovered. It wasn't until her death that the truth came out. Considering the rest of our family history is fairly uneventful, I think it's an incredible story. Story 4. My grandfather is roughly 80 and has 5 kids, one of whom is my father, all ranging from ages 40 to 50. About 3 years ago, someone knocked on his door, and it turned out he had a whole other family from before he met my grandmother in Iowa, a family no one knew about. He had married his first wife in California while he was stationed there with the Navy and had 2 or 3 children with her. After he got deployed, she apparently left with the kids. It was the mid-19s, so he never found them. He then took a cross-country trip to New York for some reason. Luckily for me, he met my grandmother in Iowa and went on to have 5 kids with her, never once mentioning his past life. Until then, we believed he had finished school, worked on a farm for a few years, then joined the Navy before eventually heading to New York and getting snagged by my grandma in Iowa. While he was doing all this, his first wife was also moving around the country. Every few years, she would place the kids in adoption, remove them again, and had 3 more children with 3 different men, but kept my grandfather's last name for all of them. Eventually, one of the original children went on a mission to find him, succeeded, and the whole group came to visit. The most bizarre part? My family is extremely chaotic, and they all live in the same trailer park owned by my uncle. The new family came and just moved right in, just as unconventional as the rest of us. We call them the new family, though technically they're the old one. It feels like a rural turf war now. Story 5. My parents used to joke about how we picked the wrong boy at the hospital. I never gave it much thought. A year ago, I'm now 17, they told me that when I was born, it happened around the same time as another boy whose parents abandoned him. We were almost the same size. You'd think this kind of thing would never happen. But I was born in China, at a hospital that somehow mixed us up. They weren't entirely sure which one of us was their child. My mother looked at both of us and insisted I was hers, despite the nurse's tag suggesting otherwise. Genetic testing was relatively expensive at the time and was declined by my mother. Since there were no parents to claim the other boy, they just took me home. Now I'm heading off to college and I have no intention of finding out whether I'm their biological son. It's strange to think about the other boy, though. People always say I look like my parents, so I trust that my mother knew best. Story 6. This happened in May of this year. I have a sister who is 4 years older than me and a half-brother who is 14 years older than me, from a different father. My aunt, who is my mom's sister, sent an email to the entire family where she vented about 60 years of resentment toward my mother. At the end of the email, she revealed that my mom had another child no one knew about, a child she had given up for adoption. This was a huge shock to our family. I asked my mom about it and found out that the child's father was my brother's dad. However, at the time, about 45 years ago, they weren't married and it was looked down upon. My mom eventually married him and had my brother a few years later. After their divorce, she remarried, this time to my dad, about 8 years later. After the email, we later found out that my aunt had taken her own life. She had doused herself with gasoline, tied herself to a pole in a garden, and somehow managed to set herself on fire. Story 7. I used to think my parents divorced because of a mutual decision, but I recently found out that my father had an affair. He was a police officer and had an affair with his partner's wife. That alone says a lot about his character. I believe my mom had fallen and split her eyebrow open, but in reality, she discovered the affair, got upset, and my father punched her in the face. I was 6 years old when all this happened. I'm now 19 and only found out a couple of months ago. My father also resents me because I decided to leave the Army after breaking both of my legs at airborne school. Ironically, I learned that he left the Marines due to painful flat feet. My aunt, his sister, told me he used to drive from Georgia to Florida every weekend because he hated the Marines so much. Now he calls me weak and has disowned me. Story 8. I live this question. My drunk aunt on the 4th of July told me 2 things that no one else knows. Sorry for the lengthy post. My mom got pregnant when she was a senior in high school by a friend and didn't tell him. She graduated in 1970 and had my oldest sister. Fast forward a few years later, she meets my dad, they get married and have 5 more children. We always knew my oldest sister wasn't my dad's daughter, as my dad is white, my mom is Mexican, and my oldest sister is half black. But we always considered her our sister. No half-sister conversations. It turns out my grandparents were very ashamed that my mom had been pregnant and unmarried, and they all decided the best thing to do was to give my sister up for adoption. When my mom had her, she just loved her, and my grandparents also realized they were making the wrong decision with adoption. They had no name picked out, so they named her after the only nurse who showed kindness to my mom. Fast forward 14 years. That sister was acting out, mostly due to my physically and emotionally abusive dad, with whom I still have a complicated relationship, and she ended up getting pregnant. My dad demanded an abortion. My mom refused, so he took my sister himself. My sister said she miscarried. My mom still doesn't know. The aunt later overheard him at the bar we own discussing the cost with a regular. Okay, number 2. So it's 1980. My parents have their 4th child together, 5th total. My sister M is born with partial hearing and some cosmetic birth defects. At the time of her birth, a doctor advised my mom that, because of our family history with reproductive issues, she should consider herself lucky she had as many healthy children as she did. She had her tubes tied before leaving the hospital. A couple of years later, she discovered she was pregnant again. At this point, our family lineup in terms of gender was FMMMF. She tells my dad, who responds immediately and angrily, saying to terminate the pregnancy. She convinces him to wait until she can see her gynecologist first to find out if it's even viable. Her doctor offers an ultrasound, the only one she's ever had. Everything is normal, healthy, and she's almost 20 weeks along. It's a girl. She shares the news with my dad, all except for that last detail. He again tells her to end the pregnancy, and she suggests finding out the gender first. She says, "Is there a way you'd consider it if it's a baby girl? They can tell now on the ultrasound." He says no, and later that night says, "Only if it's a boy." My mom calls my aunt crying, who tells her, "Then tell him it's a boy after your next appointment." She does. He's thrilled. They have the baby, and it's the first time my dad is allowed to be in the delivery room. When the baby is born, the doctors announce, "It's a girl," and my dad yells at my mom and leaves. He doesn't come back during the entire week she's in the hospital. My uncle does visit, and since she hadn't picked out a name yet, she asked for his opinion. He said he always thought his own name would be cute for a girl. And that, my friends, is why my name is Jerry. Story 9. My mom and I cared for her father as he declined with age. As his mind faded, he told stories from the war, his youth, and about my grandmother's first husband. My grandpa had a crush on her before World War II, but never acted on it because he was extremely poor. He lied about his age and joined the Navy when he was somewhere between 14 and 16, so he could be seen as respectable, so he could be worthy of her. While he was away, she married a man her parents approved of. Her first husband was abusive. He would get drunk, beat her, call her terrible names, and make her sleep in the barn. She stayed because divorce wasn't socially acceptable at the time. When my grandpa returned, dressed in his military uniform, he was told she had married and where she lived. He showed up to say hello, and there she was, a bloody mess. He took her to a doctor, helped clean her up, and convinced her to leave the man. A year later, they were married, but her ex kept showing up to harass them. The story we were always told was that her ex finally gave up and moved away. But the version my grandpa told me during a rare moment of clarity was something very different. He said, "I hated him for what he'd done to her. I knew he'd never leave her alone. I made sure he'd never bother her or any other woman again." I think my grandpa confessed to ending her ex-husband's life. Keep in mind this was a very rural part of the Midwest in the 1940s. Community justice was not uncommon. Started then. My mom was born in Colombia and moved to the U.S. when she was 12. I never knew much about her family and was always given different sugar-coated stories by relatives whenever I tried to learn more about our background. I already knew that the Italian side of my family, paternal, had ties to organized crime in New Jersey and eventually moved to Miami, where my parents would eventually meet. Through some research, I also discovered that my grandfather became an informant, entered the witness protection program after being implicated in a serious crime, and was indicted for trafficking large amounts of illegal substances. I thought I could deal with that knowledge. Disturbing, yes, but at least I had some answers. I hoped maybe my mom's side of the family wasn't as troubled. Thanks to genealogy websites and online searches, I soon found multiple newspaper articles from the 1980s reporting that my maternal Colombian grandparents were leaders of a major smuggling ring, one that was described as one of the largest operations of its kind ever carried out in the U.S. Both of my grandparents were sentenced to over 250 years each, but after that I couldn't find any further information. I have no idea how or when they died. Family rumors suggest that my grandfather passed away from a heart attack in prison after hearing that my grandmother had been killed in Colombia. My mom never talks about any of it, and I don't feel comfortable asking. Very few of my friends know this, but I find it oddly ironic that my Italian grandparents were connected to one type of crime, while my Colombian grandparents were involved in another. Story 11. We had a family Christmas dinner a few years ago, with my aunts and uncles from both sides staying over at our house. There were probably 10 or 11 of us at the dinner table, and everyone was getting along well, like we always do. My cousin, around 14 or 15 at the time, brought up something about how he had gone to the bathroom earlier that day. The kids laughed, and the adults said, "That's not dinner table conversation." Then I chimed in and said, "Haha, yeah, there are things we don't talk about at the dinner table, like politics and illegitimate children." Every adult at the table dropped their eyes to their plate and went completely silent. I sat there thinking, what in the world is going on right now? What I didn't know is that my uncle had a child outside of his marriage many years ago, and it had always been a sore subject between him and my aunt. Apparently, they had been arguing about it earlier that same day, and all the adults knew about it. It was incredibly awkward. Honestly, it was kind of surreal. But seriously, don't ever joke about illegitimate children unless you're absolutely certain that no one at the table has any. Story 12. I recently found out that my mom had been battling severe depression her entire life and had attempted to take her own life twice, before ultimately succeeding the third time. The first time I became aware of her mental health struggles was during her second attempt, when she overdosed on pain medication. I thought she was just taking a nap until I shook her for nearly 20 minutes before calling my dad. He told me to call emergency services immediately. For some reason, my uncles on my mom's side blamed my dad for her death. In reality, my mom had been struggling long before she ever met him. One of my uncles even went so far as to say that if he saw my dad again, he would stick a gun to his head and end him. We contacted the local sheriff, but unfortunately, they couldn't do anything due to a lack of evidence. My mom never completed her will, so all of her money legally went to her most closely related blood relatives, even though over $10,000 was supposed to go to me and my brother. Her family refuses to release the funds, and they even threaten that if we try to take it to court, they'll make sure my life, my dad's life, and my future children's lives are all miserable. Story 13. Coupled with the fact that I'm typing this on a phone, and I'm 99% sure no one will read this, I'll try to keep it brief. Oh, and it wasn't my family. It was my girlfriend's. But here goes anyway. Around 1994, I had my first girlfriend. I was about 19, a bit of a late bloomer, I know. Back then, AOL and dial-up internet were the norm. My brother and I discovered that with AOL, you could open a user file using a text reader. We used Xtree Gold, if I remember right, and read or even edit emails from anyone who used that computer. So we used to mess with each other by editing emails and doing other random things. As a funny side note, we also figured out how to edit video game files. For instance, when my brother played Mortal Kombat, we found the line "Raiden wins" in a text file and changed it to something like "Steven loses" or some other insult just for laughs. Anyway, I used to visit my girlfriend's parents' house often and would sometimes stay the night. She lived about 2 hours away, we had met online, and we'd sleep on the living room floor, which was in the center of the house. Her parents allowed it because they thought it was safe. In reality, we were having a relationship in that very room. Her mom was a nice woman who played Slingo on AOL all the time. I never played, but it was a game that mostly involved chatting with other people. Her mom was constantly on it and became very guarded anytime someone walked in while she was playing. My girlfriend found that odd, and she told me it made her uncomfortable. She also said her mom was overly protective of her AOL account and would instantly shut everything down if she walked in while she was composing an email. One night, my girlfriend mentioned that she suspected her mom was having inappropriate online conversations with someone other than her husband. She wished she could see her emails. I told her about the method my brother and I had used. So we tried it, and it turned out her mom was indeed having an affair. Full-blown conversations detailing everything. She had been pretending to go on church outings but was really meeting this other man. The emails described everything in detail. My girlfriend printed them all and handed them directly to her dad. Long story short, they divorced soon after. Another strange twist. My girlfriend eventually moved in with me and ended up cheating on me. On her last day with me, her dad, a former biker gang member and an incredibly intimidating man, came over to help her move. I didn't know what to expect since he was very protective of his daughters. She was a wreck after the breakup. He walked up to me, placed his hand on my shoulder, looked me in the eye, crouched down and said, "Like mother, like daughter." Then he walked away. Story 14. My family suspects my great-grandfather may have been involved in the death of my great-grandmother. People asked for details, so here's the full version. He displayed what we now believe were undiagnosed symptoms of schizophrenia. Some male members of my family have since been diagnosed with similar conditions. Their marriage was emotionally abusive. My grandmother, their only child, describes him as being incredibly cold. She has never told me directly that she suspects him, but all her children do. The police reported the incident as a botched home invasion and never investigated him. They were divorced at the time. Strangely, only his old belongings were missing from the house, and the murder weapon was believed to be a missing axe that was never recovered. Despite this, he continued to attend family gatherings, like Christmas, because there was no proof against him. No one ever confronted him. A portrait of him still hangs in my grandmother's house because her mother painted it. It's somewhat haunting to see it there, knowing what the family believes. Story 15. After my first combat tour, I got really drunk with my dad, who is also a combat veteran from the Vietnam era. We talked about violence and the emotions that come with it, mostly the disturbing mix of satisfaction and shame. And then he told me something shocking. He revealed that shortly after marrying my mother in the late 1960s, she had been assaulted. She became pregnant and carried the baby to term. All my life, I had believed this child, my oldest sister, was simply their firstborn. At the time, he had just been discharged from service and was still living near Camp Pendleton. He reached out to a few people from his old unit, rented a van, and located the man who had hurt my mother. They abducted him, drove him into the wilderness, and ended his life. What struck me most was how my dad explained his reasoning. Having studied economics after his military service, He justified it by saying, "If there's a hell, I'm already going for other reasons. So the cost of one more sin is basically zero." Story 16. I was named after my great aunt. My mother and grandmother always told me she died in a tragic motorcycle accident a few years before I was born. They also said never to bring up her name around my great-grandmother, as the loss of her daughter still haunted her. I grew up knowing very little about the woman I was named after, which seemed a bit strange, but I accepted it. When I was 24, my great-grandmother passed away. At the meal following her wake, my great-uncle had a bit too much to drink and started revealing family secrets. He casually mentioned my great-aunt Suis, and everyone else at the table nodded solemnly, except for me. "What's Suis?" I asked. "Hey, Gran told me she died in a motorcycle accident." He replied, "Yeah, that was the cover story. Your great-grandmother was too ashamed to tell the truth and needed a reason for the closed casket funeral. I learned that my great-aunt had fallen in love with another woman during university. They planned to build a life together in secret. When my great-grandmother discovered their plans, she intervened and sent my great-aunt halfway across the country to separate them. What she didn't know was that the two women had made a pact. If separated, they would end their lives. Tragically, they followed through. My great-grandmother's decision, rooted in her beliefs at the time, indirectly led to their deaths. She reportedly never forgave herself, and it haunted her for the rest of her life. After finding out the truth, I felt angry and betrayed that my family had kept this from me, especially since my name was tied to such a painful history. Since learning what really happened, I've made it a mission to honor her memory. I attend Pride every year, donate to LGBTQ+ charities, and volunteer with organizations that support the community. I often think that if the support systems we have today had existed back then, I might have had the chance to grow up with a bold, motorcycle riding and loving great-aunt by my side. Story 17. I was a twin, but I didn't find out until I was 18. Here's how it happened. When I was 18, my mom had recently started taking Ambien. One night she was heading to bed and began mumbling because the medication was kicking in. She mentioned something about your sister, but I brushed it off as incoherent talk. I didn't have a sister, just an older brother. The next day I joked with her about how funny she acted while on the medication and reminded her not to take it until she was actually in bed. I casually mentioned what she'd said. Her reaction floored me. She froze, her eyes filled with tears, and then she got emotional. "We never wanted to tell you when you were little," she said. "It was too dark for a child to understand." At first I thought she was joking. The conversation got weird so fast I couldn't process it. But then she explained. "I had always known my mom nearly died during childbirth. She was clinically dead for a short time before being revived, but I never knew why. It turns out I had a twin. My sibling died during the delivery, and the trauma nearly took my mom's life too. They never told me. Not one person in our extended family ever mentioned it, and my brother was too young to remember. So I just sat there stunned as she told me everything. Now it's surreal to think I could have had a twin, possibly even an identical sister. The whole thing changed how I view my life and family history." Story 18. When my brother and I were 9 and 10, we unintentionally outed our dad as being gay. At the time, a friend of my parents was living with us while going through a rough divorce. One day, my brother stumbled upon some adult material in the house. We laughed at it because we didn't even understand what it was, but our dad got upset and told us it belonged to that woman. Fast forward 6 months. We got our first family computer, back when people still used AOL and dial-up. That woman was no longer living with us, yet my brother and I kept finding similar material on the computer. I assume my dad didn't think we were tech-savvy enough to find anything, so he wasn't very careful. We stayed quiet because we didn't know how to process it. By the time we were 12 and 13, we started asking our mom, who was still married to him, questions. She admitted that right after I was born, I'm the youngest. He divorced her and left to explore himself. He later returned and they remarried. She suspected he might have been bisexual, but believed he was committed to making the relationship work. As we entered our teenage years, it became clear he wasn't bisexual and wasn't interested in a relationship with my mother, even though he didn't want to end the marriage. This created a strained relationship between us. I'm bitter that he kept my mom in a marriage for appearance's sake, rather than allowing her to find someone who could truly love her. I'm angry that I never had an example of a functional husband-wife relationship, and it affects my ability to relate to my own partner. Growing up, my father was often angry and verbally harsh with me, and physically aggressive with my brother. Sometimes he seemed to care about us, and other times we felt like burdens. Now I understand he was angry at himself, not us. I believe he was battling internal frustration about his identity and took it out on our family. He's now paranoid that we keep secrets from him, just like he once did. If I tell my mom about something in my life, like going back to school or traveling with friends, and he finds out after, he accuses us of lying or hiding things. Keep in mind, I'm in my mid-20s, have graduated college, and don't even live in the same town anymore. We recently found out that during all those years, he was secretly meeting with other men. That's a whole new layer to process. Honestly, I don't care that he's gay. I've supported Pride events, and many of my best friends are gay. What hurts is what he put my mom through. If he knew who he was, he should have been honest and let her go. He could still have been a good father. But instead, he trapped her in a relationship she didn't know was over and betrayed her trust, regardless of the gender of the people he was seeing. His sexuality is no longer a secret. If someone asks, he tells them openly, and he even goes on dates. I'm happy he's finally being true to himself. I just hate what it costs the rest of us for him to get there. Story 19. My mom grew up as an only child and always wished she had a sibling. About 2 years before my grandmother passed away at the age of 86, my mom discovered she had a half-sister. The half-sister was the result of a relationship between my grandmother, who was the cook's daughter, and the son of the wealthy family who owned the estate she worked at. The half-sister had been adopted by another family in the same town, and surprisingly, she and my mom used to play together as children, without knowing they were actually sisters. When my mom finally brought it up, my grandmother refused to talk about it. Still, my mom contacted her half-sister and even traveled to Canada to spend time with her. My grandmother died without ever seeing her first daughter again. After the funeral, my mom and her half-sister decided to get a DNA test to confirm their relationship. It turned out they were not just half-sisters, but full sisters. That meant the man my mom had always believed was her father wasn't actually her biological father. Quiet and reserved for most of her life, my grandmother had carried this secret for decades. It turns out she had a more complicated and hidden past than any of us had ever imagined. Story 20. It was always known as the dark family secret that my older cousin was conceived as a result of an affair. The man who was cheated on had been one of my dad's oldest friends, and he had been with the mother since they were around 12 years old. She cheated on him, got pregnant, and married the man she had cheated with. But the real story turned out to be different. The mother had assumed the baby was from the affair and left her longtime boyfriend. But when the child grew older, around 5 years old, she began to look remarkably like the ex she had left. Her husband noticed it too and demanded a paternity test. The results revealed he was not the biological father of the older child, though he was the father of their younger child, born just before the test was taken. He divorced her and left both children in her care. He eventually remarried and started a new family, moving on from the whole situation. What makes this story even more difficult is that the mother never told her ex, the actual father of the older child, that he had a daughter. They still saw each other over the years at community events, through mutual friends and church functions, but she never said a word. The child grew up in poverty, unaware that her real father had gone on to become the president of a bank. Her mother kept the truth hidden while struggling financially and raising 2 kids alone. My dad told me all of this on a fishing trip a couple of years ago, though I had suspected it before. My cousin is practically the mirror image of the man who never knew she existed. Story 21. My aunt, my mother's sister, has lived in a convent for the last 40 years. It's a particularly strict convent, Carmelite, one of those where the nuns never leave the premises and spend most of their day in prayer and mass. My parents, along with their siblings, grew up in the Belgian Congo. I've always loved looking at pictures from their youth. There's something very unique and almost surreal about them. I noticed that my aunt, the one who became a nun, was once a very beautiful, blonde girl. She always looked happy in the photos, free-spirited, almost like a hippie before hippies were a thing. The Belgian Congo wasn't as morally conservative as Belgium back then, so in the pictures, She's often seen laughing and enjoying herself with both white and black young adults. She never looked anything like the reserved and deeply religious woman she eventually became. Interestingly, no one on my mother's side of the family was ever religious. Even my grandparents were atheists, which was quite radical for 1940s to 1950s Belgium. When I was about 16, I asked my mother what had happened. What caused her sister to suddenly turn to religion so drastically? The story she told me was dark. Her father, my grandfather, was a doctor stationed deep in the jungle. He lived far from the rest of the colonials, working on a government project aimed at eradicating malaria and other diseases in remote areas of the Congo. Often he and my grandmother, who was both his assistant and a teacher to local children, would be away for weeks traveling from village to village. During these times, they left their children in the care of their local employees. This was very unusual back then, but my grandparents treated their staff like family. They ate together, lived in the same home, and treated all children equally. However, during one of their long journeys, the revolution began. Armed groups in pickup trucks began attacking white colonials in the area, using violence without mercy. In major cities, the Belgian military provided protection. But in the remote outpost where my family lived, there was only a small security presence. These defenders were quickly overwhelmed, and the revolutionaries were free to raid the homes of colonists. The employees who had cared for my family tried their best to defend the children, but they were all killed in front of my aunt. My mother and uncle were small enough to hide in a crawl space under the floor, but my aunt, who was 16, couldn't fit. She was found and assaulted by the attackers for nearly an entire day until Belgian soldiers finally arrived to rescue them. They were placed on the next plane out of the Congo and returned to Belgium. My grandparents, who were still lost in the jungle, only returned 6 months later after being hidden by villagers and moved from place to place until they found a way out. Back in Belgium, my aunt was completely traumatized. During that first half year, while waiting for her parents to return, she was left in the care of my grandmother's sister. Unfortunately, this woman offered no emotional support. She was harsh and cold, believing that my aunt's trauma was a punishment for not being religious. She handed my aunt over to a local priest to heal her and save her soul. Instead of providing psychological help, the priest filled her mind with religious ideology, eventually guiding her into the strict convent she still lives in today. When my grandparents finally returned, their daughter was already a novice. They tried to reason with her, tried to bring her home, but she refused. She barely spoke to them and focused only on converting them. For the rest of their lives, they were only able to see her through the bars of the convent's visiting room. They were never again allowed to hold or kiss her. There was only one exception. Nuns in her order are allowed one day outside the convent in their lifetime. She chose that day when my grandmother was on her deathbed. She came to the hospital, and the two of them hugged for what felt like hours. My grandmother wept with joy until the very moment she passed. Story 22. My great-grandmother on my father's side was something of a legend. She came from a poor Irish family that immigrated to the Bronx in the early 20th century. With no formal education, she married very young, at just 15, and, like many Irish women of the time, went on to have 6 children. Her husband worked for the NYPD, which back then was enough to support a large family. Tragically, he was killed in the line of duty just before the stock market crash of 1929. This left my great-grandmother to raise 6 children alone, with no money, no education, and virtually no family support. Her parents and siblings had already passed away. One day she read in the paper that a Catholic school had burned down. Fires were common back then, and she came up with a bold plan. She went to the New York Board of Education and claimed that she had been a teacher at the school, saying that all of her documentation had been lost in the fire. Somehow she convinced them she was qualified, and they placed her at another Catholic school to teach grammar. But a teacher's salary still wasn't enough to support 6 children. So she formed a close relationship with one of the senior priests at the church and school where she worked. This relationship lasted for about 30 years, and although it was kept secret, it provided significant benefits for the family. Through his influence, they received financial help, clothing, and even a townhouse. Thanks to his connections, nearly all of her sons, except the one who went to war, were able to attend Jesuit colleges at no cost. The priest eventually passed away in the early 1960s. That's when the church came knocking, claiming the house she lived in was the property of the church or the New York diocese. According to family lore, she replied, "Oh, okay. Then I'll just let the parish in on the little secret me and Father Osernum have been keeping all these years. They never brought it up again, and she lived in that house until she passed at the age of 95. Story 23. I had never known how my aunt's second husband had died. Whenever the topic came up, my parents would just say, "If you want to know, ask your aunt." Naturally, I didn't want to bring up something as sensitive as a deceased husband, so I never asked. When my grandfather passed away in 2008, I was extremely close to him. After the funeral, my grandmother told me I could choose a piece of his jewelry to keep. I picked a ring with diamonds arranged in a strange pattern. It turned out to form the letter Q, which was the first letter of the husband's last name. My cousin, whose father was the man in question, saw the ring and broke down in tears. That's when I was told the truth. My grandfather, one of the kindest, most gentle men I'd ever known, had taken a firearm in a fit of drunken rage and killed my aunt's husband. He went to prison for manslaughter before I was born. It was deemed manslaughter because the man he killed had stabbed my aunt during a domestic incident. She survived, but her husband didn't. I had no idea about any of this until after the funeral. The whole thing still unsettles me. There are so many questions I wish I could have asked. Story 24. There are at least 8 known Nazi and a couple of neo-Nazi figures in my family. My mom was the first in our family to be born in Canada, as up until 1960, our family lived in Latvia. It's not a topic my grandparents speak about openly, but I've learned that my great-grandfather worked at Auschwitz, and his brothers were stationed in various camps across Nazi-occupied territories. I never met them, so I don't know the specifics, but there were 4 brothers altogether. At the time, my great-grandfather joined what he believed was the lesser evil. The Soviets posed a massive threat to Latvia, and he joined the Nazi-aligned forces to protect his family. His sons, aged 15 to 21, later joined as foot soldiers after he went off to war. Even after the war, my grandfather believed in those ideologies until the day he died. He had married a Dutch woman who lived much longer than he did. She was ashamed of the family's past and forbade anyone from teaching me Latvian or discussing our history. Because of her, I grew up disconnected from that part of my heritage. My great-grandfather, who lived until 2010, eventually decided I should know everything. His reasoning was that ignoring history allows it to repeat. He wasn't proud of his past, but he believed he had made the best decision he could at the time, given the threat his family faced. So now I know. I know more than I ever thought I would. And no, I don't even like potatoes despite my Latvian roots. Story 25. Some background. My grandma is what you'd call an extreme conservative. She blames everything that ever went wrong with me on the fact that I didn't go to church. She thinks Obama is the Antichrist. She disapproves of the mixed-race marriage in our family, and she has a deep dislike for the LGBTQ+ community. Overall, she's a mix of strict traditional beliefs and just plain meanness. She's also verbally abusive to her husband, to the point where they don't even sleep on the same floor anymore. Every time I visit, she's yelling at him about something, and he's one of the sweetest people you'll ever meet, which makes it even more heartbreaking. There's absolutely no affection between them anymore. So one day my uncle, her son, was searching for his old baseball cards, thinking they might be worth something. He looked all over the house, cabinets, the basement, and eventually decided to check my grandma's nightstand drawer. That's when he found a stack of modern adult magazines. I remember Playboy being one of them, but I can't recall the others he listed. This discovery completely threw him off, but he never confronted her about it. There's no way the magazines belong to my grandpa. He doesn't go into her room, let alone store anything in there. My uncle is now even more convinced of his theory that she might be hiding something about her identity. She used to be extremely close with a woman she grew up with, and she would have long webcam chats with her late at night, always behind a closed bedroom door. Story 26. My biological grandfather on my dad's side died when my dad was about 4 years old. Eventually, my grandmother remarried, and the man she married became the only grandfather I ever knew. Growing up, I'd seen a few photos of my biological grandfather and heard bits and pieces of his story. The narrative was that he had taken his own life, and my dad always used that to explain his struggles with depression and other things he believed were genetic. Now in my 30s, I decided about a year ago to dig into our family history. What I found was surprising, to say the least. I used the library, public records, and even got some information from local law enforcement sources. It turns out the truth was very different. My biological grandfather was reportedly a violent alcoholic. One night he came home intoxicated and became physically aggressive with my grandmother. He grabbed his hunting rifle and began threatening her, the kids, and himself. My grandmother tried to calm him and go to bed, but it only made things worse. Things escalated into a physical altercation, and during that struggle, my grandmother ended up shooting him. Court records show that she was cleared of all charges, and the case was officially ruled as self-defense. My dad and uncle still don't know the truth. My grandmother never told them, and before she passed, she hinted that there were things in her apartment that might come as a shock. It turns out she had kept all the original documents, including her own written testimony from the 1950s. To this day, I haven't shared any of this with my father. Part of me wants to protect the memory of the man he grew up believing in. And honestly, the man who raised my dad and uncle, my step-grandfather, was the most decent, caring, and gentle person I've ever known. He treated my grandmother like a queen and did everything he could for their family. In a way, something good came out of a deeply traumatic situation, and I don't know if I want to tarnish the memory of a man who stepped up and brought love and stability to a broken home. Story 27. Not really a dark secret, but definitely an interesting and slightly creepy story I learned about my parents and their beliefs. My parents met in college during the 1970s, when psychedelics and recreational drug use were common. They were typical stoners with esoteric spiritual interests. Fast forward about 20 years to the mid-1880s. My dad was trying to become a lawyer and had moved to a different city, where he met his two future law partners. They became close friends with a psychologist who invited them to attend these gatherings where people discuss spirituality, religion, philosophy, science, and more. My parents started going to these meetings, and that's where things got a little strange. They began participating in a practice called truth and transmission. The idea was for the group to sit in a circle, many people took part, take psychedelics together, usually LSD, and then attempt to meditate as one collective consciousness. Instead of simply tripping, the focus was on synchronizing mental wavelengths through meditation and spiritual awareness. According to my mom, this experience sometimes led to bizarre things, like people shaking in unison, humming the same tones, or even saying the same phrases at the same time. The psychologist leading the group was studying how psychedelics could be used to reveal truths and deepen psychological or spiritual understanding. Originally, the group's mission was to help each person find their own sense of enlightenment. Eventually, my parents stepped away from it. My mom said things began to get a little too strange, and they wanted to focus on building a more stable life. A few years later, they had my older brother and went on to live a fairly normal family life. It's wild to think that my parents were part of what sounds like a psychological experiment or a spiritual collective. But honestly, it doesn't change how I view them. If anything, I respect that they explored ideas deeply and still built a solid life afterwards. It gives me a different kind of appreciation for their values and open-mindedness. Story 28. My aunt has always had a knack for attracting the most troublesome guys in whatever town she moves to. About 10 years ago, she called my mom in a panic, saying that her husband, my so-called uncle, had pulled a gun on her and her son. My mom immediately told my dad, an ex-Green Beret. My dad found out the guy was on a bit of a drinking binge at a local bar. So my dad drove over, walked in, and beat the living daylights out of him. Then he hog-tied him, threw him in the back of his truck, and drove him far out into the desert. When they arrived in the middle of nowhere, he untied him and gave him one simple instruction. Wait here until the sun goes down. Then walk west. Keep walking west until you can't go any farther. I never want to see you again. And with that, my dad got back in the truck and drove away. Nobody in our family knew exactly what had happened, just that the guy vanished. Recently, we found out he resurfaced and is living somewhere in Southern California. So now I know that my dad dragged a man into the desert, fully intending to scare him into disappearing forever. And to this day, I don't think my aunt knows my dad had anything to do with it. Story 29. Oh boy. On my mom's side of the family, there are so many stories. We recently found out that one of my cousins, who is a good 35 years older than me, has been having a 4-year affair with a student in Thailand. He's bought her an apartment, pays for everything, and apparently they're about to have their second child together. He already has children with his wife, who have since disowned him because of his behavior. Then there's my grandfather. It turns out he was a twin, but his identical brother died when they were young. He was so devastated, not just by the loss, but also because he felt mistreated by his own family, that he ran away from home at the age of 14 and joined the Navy. As for my great-grandfather, he walked out on his family and had numerous affairs. One of those affairs was with a woman I grew up thinking was my great-grandmother, but she wasn't. She was actually a much younger mistress he was with during the war. Apparently, she was one of many. Despite the chaos he left behind, that same woman did something incredibly kind. When my great-uncle, left homeless after his mother died and his father abandoned them, had nowhere to go, she took him in and told him he would always have a home with her. She wasn't even related to that side of the family. That great-uncle would later go on to become the CEO of a major company on the FTSE 100. To this day, he still supports the woman and her children, treating them as family because of what she did for him. Oh, and one last thing. We're distantly related to Walter Sickert, the artist. He was known for his controversial art and was, at one point, a prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, according to author Patricia Cornwell. Just another branch in the long line of unexpected characters in my family tree. Many of them were the result of affairs. There are more illegitimate children than I can count, mostly thanks to the wandering habits of the men in our family. Story 30. It's not as big as some of the other stories, but I found out fairly recently that I had an older cousin who struggled with substance use. He was considered the taboo brother. For starters, he was gay, which wasn't exactly accepted in our family. It's something that's quietly acknowledged. No one really comes out, but everyone kind of figures it out and ignores it. He was flamboyantly gay, in all caps, and that made him stand out even more. The bigger issue, though, was that he fell into hard drug use after spending time in certain nightlife circles. At the time, he and his mom were relying on government assistance. His mother misused that support for herself, buying designer clothes, jewelry, and other luxuries, while he had to drop out of school and work at a department store just to help support her lifestyle. Eventually, things spiraled. His mom left him for a boyfriend, abandoning him completely, and his life took a darker turn. His drug use grew worse, and over time it affected his mental health. These days, my mom and I occasionally see him walking down the sidewalk talking to himself. It's a tragic outcome for someone who never really had a fair shot. Story 31. Some background. When I was very young, my dad had an affair with his secretary who later became pregnant. He left my family to be with her, but he remained present in our lives. Years later, that woman, who became his second wife, fell ill and passed away, leaving my father as a single parent to my younger half-brother. The situation became more complicated later. My dad eventually remarried again and wanted to move out of his old house and start fresh with his new wife. While we were helping him pack, we came across an old box filled with photos and keepsakes from his second wife. We planned to sort through it and save anything meaningful for our younger brother. Among the items were old wedding photos of her first husband, and he looked exactly like our younger half-brother. I mean exactly alike. That raised some serious questions. After looking into it more, we realized that she had also been married at the time of her affair with my father. Given the resemblance, it's very likely that our younger brother isn't biologically related to our family at all. But we haven't said anything about it. There's no reason to. His mother is gone. We don't know how the biological father would react. And most importantly, the child needs my dad just as much as my dad needs him. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. This is one I'll probably carry with me for the rest of my life. Story 32. My father married my mother at 23, fresh out of college. They were each other's first and only, or so we thought. That illusion was shattered when my mother went to the doctor for what she thought was a urinary tract infection. It turned out to be something else entirely. Gonorrhea, transmitted from one of my father's many affairs. And he still hasn't stopped. Although he claims he's no longer involved with the family friend he continues to invite to all of our gatherings. Everyone in the family knows about it. My mom isn't close to her own relatives, so my dad's family became her surrogate support system. She's devastated. Her self-esteem has plummeted to the point where she believes no other man would love her, so she stays. But this problem didn't start with him. It seems to be a family pattern. Learned behavior even. My father's older brother has had multiple affairs, including one that led to a paternity suit. He's been secretly paying the woman for years, not to keep quiet about the affair since my aunt already knows, but to avoid a DNA test that could confirm he's the father. He doesn't see the child. He just quietly sends money to keep the mother out of his life. I grew up being told that family is everything, a mantra repeated by men who never lived by those words. It's hard to respect that message when it comes from people who don't have the decency or ethics to be called men. Story 33. My great-grandmother used to keep all of the family records in an old scrapbook that no one was ever allowed to touch or even look at. Anytime someone asked her about our family history, she would shut down the conversation. Still, she continued adding detailed records of births, marriages, and other events in that mysterious book. In our family, we used to joke that maybe we had African-American ancestry somewhere in our lineage, and that's why she was keeping it hidden. Given our known ties to the American Civil War, it didn't seem out of the realm of possibility. After she passed away, I managed to get a hold of the scrapbook. No one else in the family seemed interested in creating a family tree, so I took it upon myself. I went through old newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and church documents. I dated everything, organized them on flashcards, and put together a somewhat unremarkable family tree. But the scrapbook held more than just genealogy. It also had strange clippings, almost like something from the Weekly World News. It seemed my great-grandmother had a fascination with the unusual. Some of it was fun and quirky. But then I found something unexpected. An article about a great-aunt who had been a stage performer in the 1890s. The details were unclear, but she was somewhat locally famous. One night after a performance, she reportedly had an altercation with a strange man and then vanished. The rumor was that she ran off with him and headed west, but her family never heard from her again. All her belongings and money were still in her room. She had been deeply connected to her family, and even though she was in her late 30s, she had never shown interest in men. The police searched for her, but eventually gave up. My great-grandmother, who was born years after this event, never gave up. She spent years tracking rumors and clipping articles about her aunt's possible whereabouts. There were hints, but no closure. Eventually, I too reached a dead end in my research. To this day, I wonder why my great-grandmother was so secretive about what, on the surface, seems like a cold, missing persons case. Why go to such lengths to keep it hidden? Maybe she discovered something she didn't want anyone else to know. Whatever it was, she took that secret to the grave. Life has its mysteries, I suppose. I just wish I knew what really happened. Story 34. A few years ago, I became really interested in my family history after hearing that my mother's side came to America on the Mayflower, and my father's side came from Ireland and helped build the railroads all the way to the West Coast. It turns out that the reason my great-great-grandfather fled Ireland was because he had a bounty on his head from the British for being an officer in the IRA and allegedly having ties to multiple bombings. Apparently, our old family farm out in County Cork still has bullet holes from when British soldiers came looking for him. He escaped by boat to America and worked on the railway heading west. Essentially, he kept moving until he was as far away as possible. As for my mother's side of the family, they were apparently horse thieves. They came to America on the Mayflower, but not much else is known about them. Still, based on what little we do know, I'd bet their past was filled with shady dealings too. That branch of the family eventually made their way west, settling around Arizona and New Mexico. Cowboys, outlaws. It's unclear. There are no records of them after that point. So basically, both sides of my family tree seem to have criminal roots. And strangely enough, that gives me a bit of family pride. Story 35. I always assumed my grandfather, and really that whole generation in our family, lived pretty ordinary lives. They were kind people, mostly World War II veterans, respected members of our small community. Then one day, near the end of my grandfather's life, we had a family gathering where people started sharing stories. That's when everything changed. It turns out my grandfather and his brothers were some of the biggest bootleggers in the state. One of my great-uncles even became a state trooper and later the county sheriff. He built up strong political ties, eventually becoming best friends with the governor. Meanwhile, his brothers were building and expanding their bootlegging operation. Not only did law enforcement turn a blind eye, they actively supported the operation. They had all grown up very poor, and they made a pact that their children and grandchildren would never have to struggle like they did. Our family has always been relatively wealthy, and we were told that it was due to smart investments. Turns out, those investments had some very unconventional beginnings.